Caleb Price dragged the dented milk tank toward the locked produce shed, while storm clouds stacked over the western fields, trying to save a farm with something his family had already marked as scrap. The old stainless tank had once cooled milk on a neighboring dairy. Now one side was caved inward, the legs were gone, and faded auction paint crossed its shell. His Uncle Ross walked around it with his hands in his pockets. "You paid money for this. For the tank, no. That somehow makes it worse." Behind them, the produce shed sat closed. The washroom inside had been dark for months. Empty bins were stacked where workers once rinsed cucumbers, squash, peppers, and greens before dawn. The farm still had fields. It still had equipment. What it no longer had was enough dependable well water to wash produce at commercial volume. Restrictions on the well had turned that difference into a locked door. Caleb's father, Dean, stood beneath the shed awning holding a ring of unused keys. One season, he said, they had already discussed the terms at the kitchen table, but hearing them beside the closed building made them heavier. Caleb could modify the shed and attempt one harvest season. He could spend his own savings on fittings, testing, repairs, and whatever else the idea required. His parents would not borrow against the farm to support him. If he failed, they would proceed with the auction. No second summer, no new loan, no argument about what the farm might become someday. Dean held out the keys. "You still want this?" Thunder rolled beyond the ridge. Caleb closed his fingers around them. Yes. That answer committed nearly everything he had saved from 3 years of plumbing work. Food-safe fittings, pipe, valves, testing, repairs he had not discovered yet. Ross glanced at the battered tank. "You'd better put a lid on your miracle." Caleb looked at him. "It isn't a miracle. Good, because it looks like scrap." The first large drop struck the metal roof. Caleb unlocked the shed. The smell inside stopped him for half a second. Not rot, not dirt, emptiness. Dry concrete, old sanitizer, dust on stainless tables that had once been wet every morning before sunrise. His mother's last washroom inspection sheet was still taped beside the door. Caleb turned away before Dean could see him staring. Rain began hammering the roof. Then Caleb heard something he had never paid attention to when the farm was running. Water, a tremendous amount of it. It raced down the metal roof, filled the gutters, and spilled from one clogged corner in a silver sheet. Another downspout discharged beside the gravel lot, cutting a brown channel toward the ditch. Caleb stepped into the rain. Within seconds, his shirt clung to his shoulders. He walked from one downspout to another, watching water pour away. Behind him sat the empty milk tank. Beyond it stood the locked washing equipment. And uphill, the restricted well served a farm surrounded by water it could not use. Dean shouted from the awning, "You planning to drown out there?" Caleb looked from the roof to the tank. "No." He pointed at the downspout. "I'm trying to see how much we're throwing away." Ross laughed. "You going to catch the whole storm in that thing?" Caleb watched muddy roof water splash across the gravel. His first instinct was yes, catch everything. Every gallon the sky offered. But the water running past his boots carried dust, leaves, bird residue, rust flakes, and months of debris washed from a roof that had baked dry between storms. The farm did not merely need water. It needed water clean enough to become part of a lawful produce washing system. For the first time, the problem seemed smaller than saving the entire farm, but harder than collecting rain. He had one tank, one season, and money he could not replace. The question was whether he could control what reached that tank before one dirty storm ruined everything he was trying to save. By morning, the storm had passed. The gutters dripped, puddles shone in the gravel. The well restriction notice was still pinned inside the office. Caleb spent the first hour tracing every place water moved through the farm. The well could still supply the house and limited field needs, but not the continuous washing the produce shed had once depended on. The problem was timing. The well delivered too little when the shed needed too much. Rain did the opposite. It arrived in bursts, ran off thousands of square feet of roof, then disappeared into the ditch. Caleb stood beside the dented tank with a notebook balanced on one knee. He did not need to replace the well. He needed to shift water through time. Catch it when it came. Hold it safely. Use it later. That made the tank valuable. It also made every mistake inside it dangerous. He spent 2 days preparing it before connecting anything. He removed fittings he could not trust, cleaned and inspected the interior, replaced wetted parts with appropriate food use components, and built a stable base beside the shed. Ross watched part of the work from the tailgate of his truck. "You planning to polish the dents out too?" "No." "Good. We'd lose the character." Dean asked different questions. "How much have you spent?" "Enough." "How much is left?" "Enough if I stop finding surprises." "That isn't a number." Caleb looked at him. "You want the real answer?" Dean waited. "If this tank doesn't work, there isn't enough left for another idea." Dean nodded once. That was worse than an argument. Caleb chose the smaller roof section over the washroom for the first test. He could have connected the entire shed. That would have given him far more water. Instead, he forced himself to begin with one gutter, one downspout, and one route into storage. The old Caleb would have called that wasting opportunity. The plumber in him called it isolating a problem. He repaired the sagging gutter, cleared leaves from the outlet, and installed a line that could send runoff toward the tank or away from it. For the first time since returning home, he began arriving at the shed before sunrise without anyone asking him to. He checked connections, marked tank levels, walked the roof perimeter, wrote down what he changed. Pipe had rules. Water exposed lies. If a line leaked, it leaked. If a valve was closed, optimism could not make it open. Near the end of the week, clouds gathered again. Dean found Caleb beside the tank that afternoon. "You nervous?" "No." Dean looked at him. Caleb sighed. "Yes. Better." "Why?" "Last time you weren't nervous, you were 19 and tried to pull the disc harrow with that truck. That worked for 30 feet. It worked beautifully for 30 feet. The rain started after dark. Water ticked against the metal roof, then thickened into a steady roar. Within minutes, runoff entered the repaired gutter and rushed toward the downspout. Caleb crouched beside the line with a flashlight. The system filled fast. Water surged into the old milk tank with a hollow metallic sound. For one clean second, satisfaction hit him so strongly he forgot the cold rain running down his neck. It worked. The useless tank was filling. Water that would have vanished down the ditch was staying beside the shed. Dean came from the house in a rain jacket. Ross arrived 10 minutes later because Dean had called him. They stood beneath the awning, listening to the tank receive the storm. Ross stopped joking. That mattered more to Caleb than he wanted it to. The tank was taking on real volume, not enough to solve every need on the farm. Enough to prove the roof was not trivial. Caleb began thinking ahead before the storm had even ended. The larger roof, more collection, more stored water, maybe enough to restart washing in stages. Then he swept his flashlight across the inlet. Something moved in the water. Not bubbles. Particles. The incoming stream had turned brown-gray. Small fragments spun through it. A leaf stem struck the screen. The smell near the inlet was earthy and stale. Caleb climbed onto the base and shone the flashlight through the inspection point. Fine material was mixing through the storage. The first rush from the roof had carried everything loose from weeks of dry weather straight into his only tank. The system was filling exactly as designed. That was the problem. It was accepting everything. The next morning, Caleb took a water sample. He already knew what the result would probably tell him. Fine brown sediment had settled along the bottom curve. A dull film marked the waterline. Organic debris clung near the inlet. Still, he refused to judge the system by appearance alone. He labeled the sample, logged it, and paid for testing he could barely afford. Then he waited. For 2 days, the tank sat beside the closed shed holding water he could not trust. Dean asked, "Could you mix it with well water?" Caleb shook his head. "If I don't know what I've got, dilution isn't a plan." Ross looked through the inspection point. "Seems like a lot of effort to collect dirty rain." Caleb closed the cover. "It wasn't dirty when it fell." Ross raised an eyebrow. "It got dirty before it reached the tank." That distinction stayed with Caleb. The rain was not the problem. The tank was not the problem. The path between them was. When the result came back unacceptable for the use he intended, disappointment was sharp but not surprising. He drained the tank away from the wash system and watched days of stored water disappear. Every gallon running into the grass felt like failure made visible. Dean found him beside the drain line. "You still think this works?" Caleb watched the water go. "I think the way I did it doesn't work." "That's not what I asked." Caleb looked at him. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the roof gave us water." Dean nodded toward the drain. "It gave you that?" "No, I put that in there." For the first time, Caleb understood exactly what he had done wrong. He had treated capture as the goal. More water had felt automatically better. But after weeks without rain, The first runoff was doing work before Caleb ever saw it. It scrubbed the roof, cleaned the gutter, carried accumulated dirt and debris into whatever waited downstream. And Caleb had sent that entire opening surge directly into storage. During the next light rain, he collected runoff at intervals from the downspout. The earliest water was visibly darker. Later runoff improved. He repeated the observation at another section. Same pattern. Caleb did not need to capture the beginning of every storm. He needed to reject it. He built a first flush path that diverted the opening runoff away from storage. He kept the first test roof small enough to understand and arranged the plumbing so dirty water had somewhere intentional to go before later flow could enter the tank. He also created a calmer settling path and improved screening for larger debris. It cost more fittings, more pipe, another piece of his savings. Ross found him rebuilding the inlet. So now you're building a rainwater system that throws rain away? Yes. That sounds efficient. Caleb stood. The cleanest gallon in that tank is worth more to me than 10 gallons I can't use. Ross did not answer immediately. Caleb noticed. The next storm came 6 days later. The first runoff arrived dark. Caleb watched it leave the roof and move into the diversion instead of the tank. For several minutes, nothing entered storage. That felt wrong. The tank was empty. The farm needed water. Rain was falling. And Caleb was deliberately sending part of it away. He made himself wait. The runoff gradually changed. Less debris, less discoloration. Only after the roof had flushed did later flow move towards storage. The water entering the tank looked different almost immediately. Not perfect, not proven, but different. Caleb checked the operating indicators, recorded the tank level, let the water settle, and took the required sample. He did not celebrate. He had already learned what early confidence cost. The following afternoon, Dean found him inside the closed shed holding the result. Well, Caleb handed him the paper. Dean read it twice. This is good. For this stage, Caleb nodded. It passed. Dean looked through the open door toward the dented tank. For the first time since Caleb had dragged it onto the property, neither of them called it an experiment. But one successful tank of water did not reopen a farm. It only proved something more dangerous. The idea might actually work. And if it worked, someone might ask Caleb to make it work at a scale he had never tested. That person was Maya Chen. She bought produce for a regional grocery group Caleb's parents had supplied years earlier. Dean called to ask whether the farm still had a path back onto the supplier list if Caleb managed to reopen the wash shed. Maya arrived 3 days later wearing work boots and carrying a clipboard. She did not come to encourage anybody. Caleb liked her immediately. She walked through the empty shed first. When did you last pack commercially? Last season, Dean said. And the shutdown. Well, restrictions made the wash volume unworkable. Maya looked at Caleb. So you changed the water source. Part of it. He led her outside. She stopped beside the dented tank. That was a bulk milk tank. Yes, Ross, repairing a fence nearby, called across the yard. Former scrap pile resident. Maya looked at him, then back at Caleb. Was it used for anything unsafe after dairy service? No. It was cleaned and inspected, and I replaced the wetted fittings with suitable components. It stayed isolated from produce use until the required checks cleared. That answer changed the way she looked at him. Not warmer, more seriously. Show me. Caleb walked her through only what mattered. The roof did not drain straight into storage anymore. After a dry period, the first runoff went elsewhere. Only later flow, after the roof had flushed, could move toward the tank. He showed her the failed result and the corrected one. The first page proved he had gotten it wrong. The second proved he had learned something. Maya studied both. You kept the failed result. I paid for it. That isn't what I asked. Caleb met her eyes. Yes. She handed it back. Good. He showed her the corrected storm documentation and the operating records. Maya walked back toward the shed. Ross followed at a distance. Inside, she inspected the dormant wash line, packing tables, and cooler. You have vegetables coming. Enough for a limited harvest. How limited? Whatever I can wash correctly. That answer is going to cost you sales. It already has. For the first time, Maya smiled slightly. Better than the other answer. One of her stores needed a trial supply from a nearby grower. Not a giant contract. Not enough to save the farm by itself. A trial. If Caleb could meet handling requirements consistently and deliver accepted produce on schedule, there could be weekly orders through the main harvest. Dean folded his arms. Ross stopped pretending not to listen. Then Maya told Caleb the expected pickup window. Caleb looked toward the tank. The excitement tightened into arithmetic. One roof section had proved the principle. One tank was finite. The well remained restricted. A commercial order meant more vegetables moving through washing on tighter timing. Maya noticed his expression. Problem? No? He answered too quickly. She waited. Capacity. That's your problem to solve before you promise me volume. I know. I don't need the biggest number you can give me. Caleb, I need the number that arrives right. That sentence followed him after she left. That afternoon, Ross appeared beside the tank carrying a replacement gutter bracket. Caleb looked at it. What's that? Saw one loose on the north side. You fixing my scrap system now? I'm fixing a gutter. Caleb smiled. Ross pointed the bracket at him. Don't make it sentimental. By evening, Caleb stood behind the produce shed, looking up at the largest roof on the property. Rain caught there could dwarf what he had collected from the test section. It could give him the washing reserve the grocery order demanded. More roof also meant more dust, more debris, and a much larger opening surge after dry weather. Caleb knew that. He wrote it in his notebook. Then he looked at Maya's order window. The farm finally had a customer waiting. And suddenly, throwing rain away felt dangerous again. Caleb connected the larger roof 3 days before the first grocery harvest. He did not do it thoughtlessly. That was what bothered him later. He measured the run, checked the gutters, replaced weak brackets, added screening, extended the inlet carefully. He knew the larger roof would produce more dirty runoff at the beginning of a storm. He wrote that down too, but the tank had dropped to a level that made him nervous, and the forecast showed only one meaningful rain before Maya's pickup window. Caleb could enlarge the first flush diversion before connecting the new roof. That would cost time, fittings, and part of the rain event he was waiting for. Or he could use the existing diversion, monitor the incoming water, and capture as much as possible. He chose the second option, not because he had forgotten the first failure, because he thought he understood it. The corrected system had worked on the smaller roof. The sample had passed. He had records. Now rows of cucumbers and squash were nearly ready, and a buyer was waiting. Opportunity had turned caution into pressure. Ross helped him lift the final section of pipe. This is a lot more roof. I know. You changing the flush setup? Not today. Ross looked toward the diversion line. Thought that was the part that saved you. It is. Then why not make it bigger? Caleb tightened the coupling. Because I need this connected before the rain. Ross did not argue. By late afternoon, the larger roof was tied into the system. Nothing leaked. Nothing sagged. Every valve moved correctly. On paper, the expansion looked clean. The next morning, Caleb began harvesting for the trial order. Not everything. Only what Maya had agreed to consider. Dean helped carry bins from the field. For the first time in months, vegetables began stacking near the produce shed again. Green cucumbers, yellow squash, crates of peppers. The site changed the building. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked paused. Waiting? Dean set down a bin. Your mother came out this morning and cleaned the label printer. Caleb looked at him. She did. Dean nodded toward the office. Didn't say anything. Hope on the farm rarely arrived as a speech. Sometimes it looked like an old machine being cleaned before anybody knew whether it would be needed. That evening, the sky darkened hard and fast. The farm had been dry long enough for dust to coat every exposed surface. Wind pushed leaves across the yard. Caleb checked the bypass, checked the diverter, checked the tank level. The tank had room. That reassured him. The first drop struck the big roof. Then the storm opened. Water slammed into the gutter system with a force the smaller test roof had never produced. Caleb watched the first flush line take the opening runoff. For a few seconds, everything behaved normally. Dirty water moved where it was supposed to go. Then the larger roof began delivering more than the diversion could comfortably handle. The system did not break. That was the danger. No pipe exploded. No gutter tore loose. No valve snapped. The first flush path simply reached its practical limit while the roof was still washing itself. Caleb saw the change at the inlet. Water moving toward storage still carried a gray cast. He stepped into the rain. Ross shouted from the shed, "You shutting it off." Caleb reached the control point. The tank was filling rapidly. He could divert the whole roof away, lose most of the storm, enter harvest with almost no reserve, or keep capturing and trust that later cleaner runoff would dilute the questionable opening portion. His hand stayed on the valve. The rain intensified. The tank level rose. He waited. That was the decision. Not ignorance, not laziness. A calculation, and it was wrong. By the time the runoff looked clean, the questionable first portion was already mixed through storage. Caleb knew it. He also knew the water looked better as the storm continued. He let the tank fill. The next morning, sunlight flashed off the dented metal. The tank held more water than Caleb had ever stored, enough to make the grocery wash possible. Ross looked through the inspection point. Looks clear. It did. That was what made Caleb uneasy. The operating reading was better than during the first failed storm, but not as good as the corrected small roof run. He wrote it down. Dean arrived carrying field bins. Can we start? Caleb stared at the notebook. The harvest clock was moving. Picked vegetables did not care whether his system was fully understood. Neither did Maya's pickup window. Caleb could discard the tank based on suspicion, or follow the testing and acceptance process they had established, and let the results decide. He chose the process. They moved the harvested produce into the shed. For the first time since the shutdown, pumps hummed. Water moved. Tables became wet. Dean sorted squash while Caleb watched the wash line with a concentration that made his shoulders ache. The building sounded alive again. That afternoon, Caleb prepared the required samples and records tied to the harvested batch. The produce sat cooled and packed. Maya's trial order was no longer theoretical. It had labels, boxes, a pickup time, a customer. The result came before dawn. Caleb read it once. Then again, the water associated with the batch did not meet acceptance requirements. He stood alone in the office while the refrigeration unit hummed behind the wall. Outside, the tank was nearly full. Inside, the first commercial harvest since the shutdown was packed and ready. Neither one could give him what he needed now. He called Maya before anyone else arrived. He did not soften the result. He did not ask for an exception. The batch failed acceptance. There was a pause. Has any of it shipped? No. Then hold everything. I already am. You know what happens next? Yes. The trial order was canceled. By 7, Caleb was standing in the shed looking at boxes that had been washed, sorted, cooled, labeled, and prepared for a truck that was no longer coming. Dean entered carrying coffee. He saw Caleb's face and stopped. How bad? All of it. Dean looked toward the packed produce. Caleb nodded. They began opening boxes. There was no dramatic argument. That would have been easier. They simply did the lawful, expensive thing. The rejected batch was removed from sale and discarded rather than pushed into another market. Hours of harvest disappeared. Packaging disappeared. Cooling costs disappeared. Labor disappeared. Outside, the tank still held most of the rainwater Caleb had fought so hard to capture. By noon, the packing area was empty again. Ross came through the door. I heard. Caleb kept working. You dumped everything. Everything tied to the batch. Ross looked around. You could have sold some of it somewhere else. Caleb turned. No. Ross lifted both hands. I'm not saying you should have. That's exactly what you said. I'm saying people would. Caleb picked up another empty carton. Then they shouldn't. The shame Caleb felt was not because the system had failed. Systems failed. The shame came from knowing he had seen the warning. The larger roof, the undersized diversion, the gray cast, his own hand on the valve while he chose not to send the storm away. He had wanted the tank full more than he had wanted the system controlled. That had been the real mistake. Late that afternoon, Dean found him sitting on the loading dock. The shed was silent again. Dean sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Then Dean said, "We can still stop." Caleb stared across the yard. "The auction people haven't finalized the date. We stop spending. Sell what equipment we can. Pay back what's reasonable. You keep whatever savings you've got left and go back to plumbing." Caleb said nothing. "It isn't surrender," Dean said. Caleb almost laughed. "That's what everybody says right before they surrender." Dean looked at him. "I'm not everybody." Caleb regretted it immediately. Dean stood. "You think I want to sell this place?" Caleb looked down. "I know you don't." "No, you don't." Dean pointed toward the fields. "I watched your mother and me keep this farm alive through years when the numbers said not to. The well restriction didn't make us cowards. It made us tired." His voice softened. "You came home angry because we were ready to quit. That doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself proving we were wrong." Caleb looked toward the tank. The old milk tank had become the center of everything. Hope, expense, proof, failure. But the tank itself had done exactly what Caleb asked. It stored what he sent into it. That was the lesson he had been avoiding. His system did not need to capture more. It needed to reject more intelligently. Caleb stood. I'm not done. Dean closed his eyes for a second. Then don't make the same mistake twice. I won't. That's easy to say. Caleb nodded. So I'm going to make it harder to do. He spent the evening drawing a new layout. The original design treated the roof as one growing source. More roof connected to the same decision. One flush path. One destination. One mistake could affect everything. Caleb broke that logic apart. He divided the roof collection into separate zones that could be isolated independently. The larger roof would no longer automatically feed the tank simply because rain was falling. Each zone had to earn access to storage. He added a deliberate bypass capable of sending questionable runoff completely away from the tank, even if that meant losing most of a storm. And he stopped trusting memory. Caleb wrote an inspection sequence and fastened it inside the shed. Roof zone. Dry weather interval. Gutter condition. First flush path. Bypass position. Visible runoff condition. Tank status. Sample record. No skipped steps because harvest was waiting. No assumptions because the tank looked low. No capturing water merely because losing it felt painful. Ross found him labeling the zone controls. You putting instructions on your own system. Yes. You forget how it works. I forget how I think when I'm under pressure. Ross read the sheet. That answer silenced him. Caleb spent the next 2 days rebuilding. The work was slower because his savings were nearly gone. He reused what could safely be reused. Bought only what mattered. Tested each isolation point separately. Dean helped without being asked. At one point, Caleb handed him a wrench. Dean took it. Neither mentioned the auction. When the redesign was complete, the tank held less guaranteed water than Caleb wanted. That was deliberate. Storage was no longer the scoreboard. Control was. Caleb walked Ross and Dean through the new sequence. If the first runoff is questionable, it bypasses. Ross nodded. Even if the tank's empty, especially then. And if we lose the storm, we lose the storm. Dean looked at him. What changed? Caleb glanced at the inspection sheet. I kept thinking the farm needed every gallon. He looked toward the empty produce tables. It doesn't. He touched the bypass control. It needs every gallon we keep to be worth keeping. Maya had not promised another order. She had only told Caleb that if he produced acceptable results within the remaining season, she would review them. That was all. One more chance to prove the system. No guaranteed buyer. No rescue. Then the forecast showed a strong thunderstorm after another stretch of dry weather. The exact conditions that had beaten him before. The storm reached the farm just after 4 in the afternoon. The sky turned the color of bruised steel. Wind lifted dust from the lane and pushed it against the shed. Everything about the day tempted Caleb to repeat the old mistake. The tank was low. Harvest was close. The farm needed water, and a large storm was about to give him more than he could afford to lose. Caleb stood beside the controls with the inspection sheet in his hand. Dean came around the corner. You ready? No. Dean waited. Caleb checked the first line. Dry weather for days. Dust visible. Organic debris in 2 gutter sections despite morning cleaning. He marked it. Ross arrived as thunder cracked over the ridge. You want help? Caleb pointed toward the north roof control. Watch that zone. Don't touch anything unless I tell you. Ross nodded. No joke. No comment about scrap. The first drops were widely spaced and dark against the concrete. Then the storm struck. Rain hammered the metal roof so hard conversation became difficult. Within moments, the gutters filled. Caleb opened the first roof zone only to the bypass, not the tank. Brown-gray runoff surged through the inspection section. Dirty, Ross called. I see it. The opening flow rushed away from storage. Caleb watched the tank gauge. It did not move. Rain was falling across thousands of square feet of roof, and his storage remained nearly empty. He let the water go. The larger roof began discharging next. Its first surge was heavier. Leaves and grit struck the screen. The bypass carried the flow away exactly as Caleb had designed it to. Dean stood under the awning. You're losing most of it. I know. The words came out tighter than Caleb intended. The tank level stayed low. For several minutes, the farm was surrounded by water. Caleb refused to keep. His old instincts screamed at him. Open storage. Capture now. Let settling handle the rest. Trust dilution. Anything was better than watching the storm escape. Caleb put one hand on the valve. Then he looked through the inspection section. Still cloudy? He removed his hand. Not yet. Ross leaned closer. It's getting better. Better isn't the same as ready. Another minute passed. Then another. The water gradually changed. Visible grit diminished. The gray cast faded. Caleb checked the operating indicator. He waited for the reading to stabilize instead of taking the first favorable number. Dean shouted over the rain. Well, Caleb looked at the inspection sheet. Then at the runoff. First zone stays bypassed. Ross stared at him. That one looks almost clear. Almost. Caleb moved to the smaller roof section. Its runoff had cleaned faster. He checked again. Stable. He changed the valve position. For the first time that afternoon, rainwater entered the tank. The sound struck the stainless shell with a hollow rush. Relief hit Caleb immediately. He forced himself to ignore it. One zone had earned access. The others had not. That was the redesign. Not one decision for the whole storm. Separate decisions. Separate consequences. The larger roof continued to bypass. Minutes later, its runoff finally improved. Ross stood beside him. This is where you opened it last time, isn't it? Caleb watched the water. Earlier. Ross looked toward the bypass stream. You knew it was questionable. Caleb did not defend himself. Yes? Rain drummed between them. Ross nodded slowly. Keep throwing it away. Caleb looked at him. Ross pointed toward the tank. Until you're sure. It was the first time Ross had trusted Caleb enough to support the choice that looked wasteful. Caleb waited. Only when the runoff met the conditions he had written before the storm did he change the route. Cleaner later flow entered storage. The tank level began to rise. Not as fast as before. That no longer mattered. By dusk, the thunder had moved east. Caleb isolated the inflow and let the tank settle. He did not announce victory. He did not reopen the shed. He did not touch the waiting harvest. The next morning, he returned before sunrise. Dean and Ross were already there. Caleb checked the tank condition. The visible water was clear. The operating reading remained where he needed it. He repeated the check. Same result. Ross looked through the inspection point. So that's it? No. Caleb prepared the required samples. That means we did enough to ask the real question. He sealed the containers and matched the records against the storm inspection sheet. Every roof zone decision was there. Every bypass step. Every transition. Nothing depended on Caleb remembering later what he hoped he had done. Maya answered when he called. We ran the redesigned system through the storm. And the dirty runoff never entered storage. Later flow met our operating checks. Samples are going in now. When will you know? Before the next harvest window if everything stays on schedule. And if it doesn't pass, we don't ship. Maya was quiet. Send me the records. I will. The physical test was over. The system had finally done what Caleb should have demanded from it from the beginning. It had refused bad water before accepting good. But the farm was not reopened. The produce was still in the field. Maya had not restored the account. The auction question had not disappeared. Somewhere beyond the farm, the samples carried the final decision Caleb could no longer influence. For the first time all season, he had nothing left to redesign. The results arrived the next afternoon. Caleb was in the field cutting cucumbers when his phone vibrated. Dean was 20 yards away loading bins. Ross was repairing a latch on the harvest wagon. All summer, Caleb had imagined proof as something dramatic. A tank filling, a valve opening, a storm breaking over the roof. Instead, the future of the farm arrived as a file attachment on a phone with dirt under the case. Caleb opened it. He read the result once, then again. The required samples passed. He stood between the rows while the words settled into meaning. Not close, not promising. Passed. Dean saw his face. What? Caleb looked up. They cleared. Dean did not move. The water. Yes. The required results. Passed? Ross dropped the latch he was holding. Nobody cheered. Caleb had thought they might. Instead, Dean walked toward him slowly. Call Maya. That was when Caleb remembered the result was only part of the answer. A passing sample did not force anyone to buy vegetables. Maya still controlled the account. The farm still had to deliver accepted produce on time. Caleb called. She answered on the third ring. I just got the results. So did I. Caleb waited. The records matched the storm run. Yes. Same isolated zones. Yes. Same bypass procedure you sent me. Yes. Another pause. Then she said, "Harvest conservatively. I'll take the trial shipment we discussed." Caleb closed his eyes. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow." He opened them. "And after that?" "After that, you prove you can repeat it." It was not a rescue. It was better. A real standard. A real order. A chance that depended on Caleb doing careful work again. "We will." The produce shed reopened before sunrise. Dean switched on the lights. Caleb opened the washroom door. For the first time in months, nobody was pretending they were only testing equipment. Bins came in from the field. The water system was checked before the first vegetable moved. Roof zones isolated. Tank condition logged. Wash process ready. No shortcuts because the buyer was waiting. No skip step because the harvest looked good. Ross carried in the first crate. "You gonna read that sheet every morning?" "Yes." Ross set the crate down. "Good." The first shipment was smaller than the batch they had lost. Caleb chose that deliberately. He could have packed more. The fields could have supplied more. But Maya had asked for consistency, not ambition. By mid-morning, boxes of cucumbers, squash, and peppers were stacked in the cooler. Clean labels. Complete records. No frantic improvising. When the truck arrived, Caleb watched the pallet disappear through the loading door. The empty space it left felt different from the emptiness after the rejected batch. That emptiness meant something had gone out into the world and been accepted. Maya confirmed receipt later that day, then acceptance. The following week, another order came. Then another, not huge. Weekly. Predictable enough for the family to plan harvests around. Valuable enough to keep the produce shed operating. The farm did not suddenly become rich. The well restriction did not vanish. Rain did not arrive whenever Caleb wanted it. There were still dry weeks when tank levels fell and harvest volume had to be adjusted. But Caleb no longer treated a full tank as victory. The scoreboard had changed. Usable water. Accepted produce. Repeatable procedure. Trust. By late summer, Maya converted the trial arrangement into a seasonal account. The news reached Ross while he and Caleb were cleaning a gutter before another forecast storm. Ross looked down from the ladder. "So the scrap tank got you an account?" Caleb shook his head. "No." Ross waited. "Throwing away dirty water got us the account." Ross laughed. "That's a terrible slogan." "It's accurate." Ross climbed down. For a moment, he rested one hand against the dented stainless shell. "I was wrong about this thing." Caleb looked at him. Ross immediately added, "Don't enjoy it too much." "I'm trying not to. You're failing." That evening, Dean asked Caleb to meet him by the road. The old farm sign had been taken down during the shutdown. Caleb had not seen it in months. Now it leaned against the fence, freshly cleaned. The paint was still faded. The bottom edge still showed years of weather. Dean had replaced the rotten hanging board. Caleb stared at it. "What are you doing?" Dean lifted one end. "What does it look like?" "You said the auction." "I said failure triggers the auction." Dean looked toward the produce shed. Empty harvest bins were being moved inside for the next morning. The cooler hummed. Above the dented milk tank. The gutters were clean and divided into the zones Caleb had marked. Dean looked back at him. "This doesn't look closed to me." Together, they carried the sign to the posts. Dean climbed the short ladder and rehung it. Caleb steadied the bottom. When Dean stepped down, neither man spoke for a while. They simply stood beside the road looking back at the farm. The old milk tank was visible from there. Still dented. Still ugly. No longer laughed at. Above it, clean gutters waited for the next storm. Inside the reopened shed, sale-ready produce waited for the next weekly shipment. Caleb finally understood that saving the farm had never depended on capturing everything they were offered. It depended on knowing what to keep